In the small, fog-shrouded town of Graven Hollow, whispers of old legends still lingered in the hearts of its residents. It was a place where shadows danced a little too long and the nights seemed impossibly deep, as if the moon itself feared to fully shine. Among the tales passed down through generations, one name had always stood out, Vladislaus, the Undying. Few knew the full truth about him, but his name was whispered with a mixture of awe and dread. He was said to have lived in the town centuries ago, a nobleman with an insatiable hunger for power and something far darker. Some believed he had made a pact with something ancient, something forbidden, to gain immortality, but the price he paid had left him cursed, forever thirsting for blood, for life, for the essence that flowed through human veins. One night, as the fog wrapped itself around Graven Hollow like a tightening noose, a stranger arrived. He was tall, with pale skin that seemed to glow under the dim street lights, his eyes a deep, unsettling shade of red. He moved through the streets with an otherworldly grace, his presence both mesmerizing and terrifying. The people of Graven Hollow were drawn to him, unable to look away. The stranger took up residence in the old, abandoned manor on the edge of town, a place long thought to be haunted. It was said that no one who entered the manor ever returned, but the stranger seemed undeterred, and soon rumors began to swirl. Some claimed to have seen him at night, walking through the woods, his silhouette barely visible through the mist. Others swore they heard strange, animalistic sounds coming from the manor after dark. The townsfolk, already superstitious, grew more and more fearful. Cattle were found dead, drained of blood, their bodies cold and lifeless. Soon, it wasn't just animals, people started to disappear. First, it was an elderly man, known for his evening strolls along the river. Then a young girl, who had ventured too far from her home at dusk. Each time, the townspeople would find nothing but a trail of blood leading into the forest. One night, a young woman named Ilara, desperate to find her missing brother, made her way to the manor. She had heard the stories, but her fear of what had become of him outweighed her terror of the place. Armed with nothing but a flickering lantern and a prayer, she approached the decaying gates. The air around the manor was thick with the scent of death and decay. The heavy wooden doors creaked open as if expecting her, revealing a grand hall cloaked in darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint dripping of water echoing through the corridors. Alara ventured deeper, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel eyes on her, watching her from the shadows, but she saw no one. Then, as she turned a corner, she came face to face with him, Vladislaus. His red eyes gleamed in the darkness, his pale lips curved into a cruel smile. "You should not have come here," he whispered, his voice soft, like the rustling of leaves in a dead forest. Alara tried to speak, to demand answers, but her voice failed her. She could only stare at the creature before her, her brother's fate hanging in the silence between them. Without warning, Vladislaus moved, faster than she could comprehend. He was inches from her in a heartbeat, his breath cold on her skin. "Do you seek him?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Alara nodded, unable to tear her gaze from his. Vladislaus smiled, revealing sharp, gleaming fangs. "He is one of us now." His eyes bore into her, and she could feel something inside her shift, as if his gaze alone could pierce her very soul. Suddenly, there was movement behind him. A figure stepped out of the shadows, pale and gaunt, with dead eyes that once held life. It was her brother, his face twisted with hunger. "Join us, sister," he rasped, his voice hollow and empty. Alara screamed, backing away, but Vladislaus was too quick. He caught her wrist, his grip like iron. "You have a choice," he said softly. "Stay with your family, or die." Tears streamed down Alara's face as she looked at her brother, now a twisted reflection of the boy she had loved. She knew there was no escape, but before she could answer, Vladislaus leaned in closer, his lips brushing her ear. "The night is eternal, Alara, and so is the hunger." With a sharp, sudden motion, he released her. "I will give you time," he said, his voice almost kind. "But remember, I always return for what is mine." Alara fled the manor, her heart racing, but the words echoed in her mind. The hunger, the night, eternal. She ran, but deep down, she knew she couldn't escape him. Not forever. In the nights that followed, Alara felt the weight of eyes on her, always watching from the shadows. Whispers of Ladislas's name followed her wherever she went, like a cold wind that wouldn't leave. The people of Graven Hollow had grown quieter, more fearful. And one night, as the moon hung high and pale in the sky, Alara woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside her door. The hunger had come for her, and it would never stop. The tale of Ladislas and Alara was far from over. In the depths of the night, something darker awaited, a hunger that would never be satisfied, a curse that had only just begun. Alara bolted upright in her bed, her breath ragged, heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps outside her door had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating, as if the night itself had come alive. She strained to listen, expecting at any moment to hear the creak of her door opening, the sound of that soft, mocking voice calling her name. But there was nothing. Slowly, cautiously, she slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She grabbed the small silver cross that had belonged to her mother, an old family heirloom, and clutched it tightly in her hand. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. For what felt like hours, Alara stood frozen in the middle of her room, her eyes locked on the door. But no one came. No shadowy figure appeared to claim her. No blood-red eyes gleamed from the darkness. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves, and after what seemed like an eternity, she crept toward the door. With trembling hands, she unlocked it and peered out into the hallway. The house was still, bathed in the faint silver glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. Everything appeared normal except for the faint trace of footsteps in the dust on the floor, leading away from her room and down the stairs. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been there. Alara followed the trail cautiously, her fingers brushing the cool walls as she descended the stairs. At the bottom, the footsteps stopped abruptly in front of the large bay window that overlooked the garden. For a moment, she thought whoever had been there had vanished into thin air. But then she saw it just beyond the window. Standing motionless under the old oak tree was a figure cloaked in shadow. Ladislas. He stood perfectly still, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, watching her with an eerie calm. Alara felt her stomach twist with fear, but something else stirred within her, something she couldn't quite understand. It was as though a thread connected them, an invisible force pulling her toward him. Suddenly, without warning, the figure next to Ladislas moved. Alara's heart dropped. It was her brother. He was pale, even more gaunt than when she had seen him last, his once vibrant eyes now dull and lifeless. But it was unmistakably him. He stood at Ladislas's side like a puppet, his head lowered, as if awaiting a command. Ladislas smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent shivers down Alara's spine. "I told you," his voice whispered through the air, though he didn't move. "I always return for what is mine." Alara stumbled back, gripping the cross tighter. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice trembling. Ladislas stepped forward, but his feet never seemed to touch the ground. "I want what I am owed, Alara. You carry a legacy far older than you know." His gaze locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, she felt her mind slip, as though something was reaching inside her, trying to uncover a secret she didn't even know she had. Alara gasped, breaking the spell. "What are you talking about?" He chuckled softly, a sound that felt as ancient as the night itself. "Your bloodline is cursed, child. Your mother's cross cannot protect you from what is in your veins. Your family has been bound to me for centuries." Alara's breath caught in her throat. "That's a lie," she spat, though she felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. "My mother, my father, your mother was warned, but she thought she could escape." Ladislas's smile widened. "But no one escapes me. Not for long." Alara's mind raced, memories flashing before her, the strange warnings her mother had given her as a child, the way her parents had moved from town to town, always fleeing something but never explaining why. Could it be true? She shook her head, refusing to believe it. "You're trying to control me, just like you did my brother." But Ladislas's expression remained calm, as if he knew something she didn't. "Your brother accepted his fate, just as you will. The hunger will find you soon enough. At that moment, her brother raised his head, his dead eyes locking onto hers. "Join us, Alara," he whispered, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You cannot fight it." Panic surged through her, but so did something darker, something that had been lurking deep within her ever since her first encounter with Vladislav. A part of her didn't want to run. A part of her was curious, drawn to the darkness like a moth to flame. But before she could say anything, Vladislav turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the fog that had crept up from the forest. Her brother followed, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man in a trance. Alara stood frozen at the window, watching them vanish into the mist. The pull she had felt moments before still lingered, tugging at her insides, whispering that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. For days, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed. Her dreams were plagued with visions of Vladislav's, of the manor, of her brother's hollow eyes. She woke up each morning feeling drained, as if she had run for miles in her sleep. But worse than the fatigue was the hunger. It gnawed at her constantly, growing stronger with each passing night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alara found herself standing at the edge of the woods, staring in the direction of the manor. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the cross around her neck, but she knew it wouldn't protect her forever. The hunger was building, a dark force rising within her, calling her to something she didn't fully understand. And in the distance, through the trees, she could have sworn she saw a pair of red eyes watching her. The night was coming for her, and this time, she might not resist. The pull of the darkness had only begun to reveal its secrets. What was buried in Alara's bloodline? And how long could she resist the hunger that threatened to consume her? The answers lay in the shadows of Graven Hollow, waiting for her to uncover them or to succumb to them. Alara stood at the edge of the woods, her heart heavy with the weight of the darkness inside her. The hunger clawed at her insides, pulling her toward the manor where Vladislav waited. She could feel the connection to him growing stronger with each passing moment, like a thread winding tighter around her soul. The temptation to give in, to join her brother in that cold, eternal night, was overwhelming. But then, something stirred inside her, a flicker of light, faint but persistent. She remembered her mother, the stories she had told her as a child, the way she had always protected her. Her mother had fought to keep her safe from this very fate. There had to be a way to break the curse. Clutching the silver cross around her neck, Alara whispered a quiet prayer. She didn't know if it would work, but she had to believe there was still hope. She turned away from the forest, determined not to let Vladislav control her. But as she began to walk back toward the village, the hunger surged, more powerful than ever. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the grass. The world around her darkened, and in the distance, she heard the soft, mocking voice of Vladislav. "Come to me, Alara. You cannot fight what you are." For a moment, she almost gave in. The darkness promised an end to the pain, an eternity free from fear, free from the weight of human suffering. But then, she remembered her brother, how empty he had looked, how lifeless. That wasn't freedom. It was slavery to the hunger, to the night. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Alara forced herself to stand. She pressed the silver cross to her chest, feeling its cold metal against her skin. Her mother had always said it was more than a simple heirloom, it was a symbol of their family's strength, a reminder that light could conquer even the darkest of nights. Alara began to walk again, this time with more purpose. She didn't know where she was going, but she felt drawn toward the church in the center of the village. It was old, its walls crumbling, but it had stood for centuries as a place of refuge, a sanctuary against evil. As she approached the church, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. She could feel Vladislav's presence, his eyes on her, but she pressed on. The hunger clawed at her, but she refused to let it win. When she reached the church door, she hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of incense and old wood. The dim light from the candles flickered, casting long shadows across the worn pews. Alara knelt at the altar, holding the cross in both hands. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. If there's any way to end this, if there's any way to free my brother, show me. For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence was heavy, oppressive. But then, just as Alara thought all hope was lost, she felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was faint at first, like the glow of a single candle in a dark room, but it grew stronger, pushing back the cold, the hunger, the darkness. Alara gasped, her eyes widening. She could feel the curse loosening its grip on her, the thread that had bound her to Vladisla's frame. The cross in her hands glowed faintly, the silver warming under her fingers. In that moment, she understood. The curse was not unbreakable. It was tied to the hunger, to the darkness inside her, but it was not stronger than the light within her. As the warmth grew, Alara felt the hunger fade. The gnawing emptiness inside her was replaced by a sense of peace, a clarity she hadn't felt in days. She rose to her feet, the cross still glowing softly in her hand. Outside the church, the fog began to lift. The shadows that had seemed so menacing now appeared weak and insubstantial. Alara walked out into the night, no longer afraid. Vladislas was waiting for her at the edge of the forest, his red eyes gleaming. But as Alara approached, the light from the cross in her hand grew brighter, and the air around her seemed to shimmer with an unseen force. "You think you've won?" Vladislas hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You cannot escape me. The hunger will return. It always does." But Alara stood tall, unshaken. "No," she said, her voice strong and steady. "The hunger dies with you." With that, she raised the cross, and a brilliant light erupted from it, flooding the forest with a radiance so pure and bright that it seemed to burn the very shadows away. Vladislas let out a howl of fury, his form beginning to dissolve into the mist. As the light consumed him, his final words echoed through the night. "This is not the end, Alara. I will return." But Alara didn't flinch. She watched as Vladislas faded into nothing, his presence erased from the world. The fog lifted completely, revealing a clear, starry sky. The night was peaceful once more. Alara stood alone at the edge of the forest, the cross in her hand cool and silent. The hunger was gone, and with it, the curse that had haunted her family for generations. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of freedom for the first time. But as she turned to walk back toward the village, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Slowly, she turned to look. Her brother stood in the distance, his form no longer gaunt or lifeless. He smiled, a sad, grateful smile, and for a brief moment, Alara thought he would say something. But then he vanished, fading into the night like a ghost released from its chains. Alara wiped a tear from her cheek, her heart heavy with both sorrow and relief. She had freed him, and herself, from Vladislas's curse. The night would no longer hold them captive. As she walked back to the village, she knew the darkness was still out there, lurking in the shadows. But now, she carried the light within her, and no matter how deep the night, she would never let it consume her again. The curse was broken, but the legacy of Graven Hollow would live on. The night was vast, and in its depths, ancient forces still stirred. But for now, Alara had found peace, and the light she carried would shine on, guarding against whatever shadows might come next.